ever lay awake at night just like
Yeah.
wrestling with these huge questions? You know, the ones I mean about faith and life and even the afterlife.
Yeah.
Well, we're diving deep into one of those today. The age-old question of how a loving God could allow the existence of hell.
Yeah, it's a question that's challenged theologians and just everyday people alike for centuries,
Oh, yeah.
and it gets right at the heart of how we understand both God and love.
You got that right.
Yeah.
And for this deep dive, you send over some excerpts from Timothy Keller's The Reason for God,
Right.
especially chapter 5, where he really tackles this head on.
Yeah.
It seems like every time I open this book, there's a new layer to uncover.
Yeah. Keller's just really good at taking complex theological concepts and making them really relatable.
He is.
And in this chapter, he starts off with some very human stories, like Hartmut, a German grad student who just can't reconcile this idea of a God who demands appeasement through suffering.
Okay.
And then there's Josie, the art gallery worker, who just finds the whole idea of hell, well, cruel.
Yeah, and their reactions, even though they're coming from these different angles,
Right.
they really highlight the heart of the problem, don't they? How can a God who is supposed to be all-loving also be the one who is, like, dishing out eternal punishment? It's a contradiction that so many people struggle with today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Keller connects this modern skepticism to what sociologist Robert Bellah called expressive individualism.
Okay.
This idea that we're each ultimately responsible for creating our own truth and morality.
Okay, so instead of looking to a higher power for those big answers, we've become the ultimate judges of right and wrong.
Exactly. It's like we've stepped into the role of the divine,
Oh, wow.
deciding for ourselves what is acceptable and what is not.
Right.
And so naturally, this is going to clash with the idea of a God who sets the ultimate rules.
Right. This reminds me of C.S. Lewis's observation that, you know, modern thought often tries to reshape reality to fit our desires instead of the other way around.
That's such a good connection. Because if there is no higher power,
Right.
if there is no ultimate accountability,
Right.
then essentially we become free to just create our own versions of reality.
It's like saying, well, this is okay because I say it's okay.
Yes.
And you're wrong because I disagree with you.
Mm-hmm.
We see this playing out in so many ways today.
Absolutely. Think about how often you hear the phrase, don't judge.
Oh, all the time.
It's used to shut down any conversation about morality or consequences,
Well, for sure.
particularly when it comes to, let's say, sexual ethics.
Yeah, that's a huge E shift. If there's no ultimate right or wrong, there's no ultimate judge, then the whole idea of judgment, especially eternal judgment, becomes unthinkable.
And this is where Keller throws a curveball, right?
Okay.
He argues that this modern idea of a purely loving God, one who doesn't judge at all, actually finds its roots in Christianity itself.
Wait, seriously? That's not what I would have guessed at all.
Right.
Yeah.
And to prove his point, he looks at other major religions.
Okay.
Ancient paganism, for example. They had gods that were often driven by ego and power struggles.
Right.
Not exactly models for pure love.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. What about a religion like Buddhism?
Okay.
They're all about peace and compassion.
True, Buddhism does emphasize compassion, but it doesn't have a personal God in the same way that Christianity does.
Right.
It's more about achieving enlightenment and escaping the cycle of suffering.
Okay, so where does that leave us? If this idea of a solely loving God isn't really like a universal concept, then where did it come from?
Yeah, and Keller even shares some of his own experiences talking to Muslim scholars.
Okay.
And they found the Christian idea of having a personal relationship with God, almost like a best friend or a spouse, shockingly disrespectful.
Whoa, my mind is officially blown. So much for that being a universal truth.
And that's the point Keller drives home. This idea of a solely loving God, a God who doesn't judge, isn't as common as we might think.
Well,
And that begs the question, if it's not rooted in, like, the world's religions or even our human experience, where does it originate?
right.
Which brings us right back to the Bible.
Which, as we've been discussing, also happens to be the source that talks about God's judgment and wrath. Okay, now we're really getting into the thick of it. So how do we even begin to reconcile these seemingly contradictory ideas of a God who is both loving and just?
Right.
And what does that mean for this whole concept of hell? Okay, I've got to admit my brain is doing like backflips after that last point.
Yeah.
The idea that our modern concept of a purely loving God might actually spring from the same source that talks about judgment and hell.
Yeah.
That's seriously making me rethink some things.
It really highlights how we can sometimes create these, like, simplified versions of complex ideas.
Right.
And when it comes to God and love, things are rarely simple.
Understatement of the century.
Yeah.
So how does Keller start to untangle this knot?
Yeah.
Because let's be real, reconciling a God of love with a God of judgment,
Right.
that feels like a task for, like, theological superheroes.
Right. He starts by asking a question that seems deceptively simple. Can a God of judgment truly be a God of love?
Okay.
You know, we tend to think of love and anger as these complete opposites. Like
Yes.
they can't possibly exist in the same being, let alone the same heart.
Right. It's like, pick a side. Are you team lovey-dovey or are you team tough love?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Keller throws a wrench in that whole line of thinking.
Okay.
He points out that in the context of love, anger isn't always a negative thing.
Okay.
It can actually be a really powerful indicator of how deeply we care.
Okay, I can see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
It's like when you see someone, like, being reckless with something that you really care about.
Right.
It's not that you hate the person. It's that you're angry that they're being careless with something that's precious.
There you go. And Keller uses this amazing quote from Becky Pippert that I think really brings it home.
Okay.
She says, "Anger isn't the opposite of love. Hate is. God's wrath is. His settled opposition to the cancer, eating out the insides of the human race he loves."
Wow.
It's not about vengeance. It's about protecting what he loves from something destructive.
So it's less about punishing us and more about trying to stop something that's ultimately harmful.
That's exactly it.
Okay.
Now hold on to that thought because I want to bring in another really powerful voice on this subject. Theologian Miroslav Volf.
Okay, lay it on me.
So Volf experienced the horrors of the Balkan conflict firsthand.
Okay.
And his perspective on this is really challenging.
Okay.
He suggests that it's actually the lack of belief in God's ultimate justice that can lead to a more violent world.
Whoa, really? That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Wouldn't believing in a God who judges make people more likely to judge and punish each other?
It's tempting to think so, but stay with me.
Okay.
Volf argues that if there's no ultimate accountability for evil, for injustice,
Right.
then we're more likely to take matters into our own hands.
Oh, wow.
It's like if the scales are never going to be balanced,
Right.
then we feel this primal urge to try and balance them ourselves.
So believing in a God who ultimately rights the wrongs can actually give us permission to let go of that need for revenge. That's a pretty radical idea.
Right. It's like we're able to say, okay, I don't need to seek vengeance because I trust that there's a higher power who will ultimately handle it.
Right.
Volf contrasts this with what he calls the live and let live approach.
Okay.
On the surface, it sounds peaceful, right?
Right.
But he says it can actually mask a dangerous indifference to true suffering.
You mean like just brushing things under the rug and pretending that the horrific things aren't happening?
Exactly. And Rolf argues that, especially in a world as messed up as ours,
Right.
that kind of response just doesn't cut it.
Right.
Simply saying, don't you see that violence doesn't solve anything? Ignores the very real need for justice that people feel.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Right.
It might look okay from a distance, but it's not actually healing anything.
It's-
So if I'm understanding this correctly, believing in a God who holds everyone accountable can actually be a source of comfort,
Right.
even in the face of pain and suffering.
Because allows us to release the burden of being the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner.
Wow.
We're free to leave that to God, to trust that justice on a cosmic scale will ultimately be served.
Right.
But this brings us to the heart of the matter. What is Heller? And Keller challenges the popular image of a fiery torture chamber.
Yeah, the whole fire and brimstone thing.
Yeah.
Honestly, even as a kid, that image never quite sat right with me. It
Yeah.
just felt a little too, well, vengeful for a God who's all about love.
Exactly. And Keller digs into the Bible and comes up with a different perspective.
Okay.
He suggests that hell isn't so much a place as it is a trajectory, a natural, eternal progression of a soul that's choosing to live separated from God.
Okay, so less about God actively throwing people into a fiery pit and more about the natural consequences of their choices.
Precisely.
Right.
And this is where the metaphor of fire takes on a whole new meaning.
Okay.
It's not about literal flames, but rather about the slow disintegration of the soul, like a tapestry unraveling thread by thread.
So what does that look like, this unraveling? Give me the rundown.
Keller uses the parable of Lazarus and the rich man to really drive this point home.
Okay.
Remember that one?
Okay, refresh my memory.
Ugh.
Parables aren't exactly my strong suit.
No worries. It's about Lazarus, this poor, sick beggar, and this really wealthy guy.
Okay.
They both die.
Okay.
Lazarus ends up in heaven, while the rich man is in a place of torment. And here's the kicker. Even though he's suffering, the rich man is totally clueless about why he's there.
Classic. So what is he complaining about the lack of room service in hell?
Pretty much. He's fixated on his own needs,
Yeah.
even asking for Lazarus to be his servant.
Oh, wow.
He even blames God for not giving him enough information about the afterlife. He's completely blind to his own selfishness and the choices that led him there.
Talk about missing the point.
Right, and it's this blindness, this utter lack of self-awareness, even in the face of suffering,
Right.
that truly defines hell in this parable.
So it's less about physical torture and more about this inner anguish, this eternal separation from God and everything good.
Exactly. It's the inevitable outcome of a soul clinging to its own self-righteousness, refusing to acknowledge its need for God.
I've got to say, that's both fascinating and terrifying. It's one thing to imagine hell as a fiery pit.
Yeah.
But the idea of this eternal self-inflicted disintegration, that's a whole new level of unsettling.
It is, isn't it? But it also highlights something incredibly profound. The immense respect that God has for our free will.
Yeah.
Even when our choices lead us down a path of destruction, he honors our freedom to choose.
Okay. That's a lot to process. It makes sense, but it's still hard to swallow.
Yeah.
If God loves us so much, why even give us the option to choose a path that leads to so much suffering?
Yeah.
Wouldn't a truly loving God intervene?
I have to admit, as much as this whole hell as a trajectory thing is making more and more sense, it still feels like we're bumping up against this huge paradox.
Right.
If God's love for us is the real deal, then why give us the freedom to choose a path that leads to suffering like that?
Wouldn't a truly loving God step in and stop us from making such a devastating choice?
You've hit the nail on the head with that question.
Yeah.
It's the crux of the whole issue, isn't it?
Feels like it.
And wouldn't you know, Keller brings in our friend C.S. Lewis again for this one.
Okay.
Lewis wrote, he said, "There are only two kinds of people, those who say, 'Thy will be done' to God, or those to whom God in the end says, 'Thy will be done.'"
Wow.
Powerful stuff.
So what I'm hearing is that no matter what, we're always choosing.
Yeah.
We're either consciously choosing God's path
Yes.
or we're choosing our own way, and he ultimately honors that choice, even if it leads to hell.
Exactly. And Lewis goes on to say, all that are in hell choose it. Hell is the greatest monument to human freedom.
Wow.
It means God values our freedom to choose, even above our happiness, even above our eternal well-being.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
It is.
But I guess if we really think about it, true love can't exist without freedom, can it?
Right.
I mean, would we really value a love that was forced or coerced?
Yeah.
A love where we didn't actually have a choice?
Exactly. Imagine a relationship where someone was manipulated or controlled into saying, "I love you."
Yeah.
It wouldn't be genuine, would it?
Right.
True love has to be freely given.
Yeah.
And that means there's always that risk of rejection.
Yeah.
The possibility that the other person will choose to walk away.
Okay, now it's all clicking into place.
Yeah.
God isn't some puppet master.
Right.
He's not forcing us to love him.
Well,
He's offering us a choice.
yeah.
And as terrifying as that freedom is, it's also incredibly beautiful.
It is. And this all circles back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay. That concern those journalists had about the equality of people,
Right.
if we really believe in free will, then no one's destiny,
Right.
whether heaven or hell, is predetermined.
Yeah.
We're all on a journey, and ultimately we're responsible for the choices we make along the way.
It's humbling, isn't it? We want to put people into these neat little boxes. We
Yeah.
want to judge them and label them. But this reminds us that we're not the ultimate judges of anyone.
Yeah.
We don't get to decide their eternal fate. And honestly, thank goodness for that.
I agree.
Who are we to hold that kind of power?
It's a good reminder to just focus on understanding, not condemnation.
Yeah,
Each person's story is complex,
right.
and their relationship with God is ultimately between them and him.
It makes you want to just let out a deep breath and just let go of that need to judge, you know?
Maybe focus more on our own journeys, our own choices, and leave the judging to, well, the ultimate judge.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think we've given our listener a lot to chew on today.
You can say that again.
Yeah.
This deep dive has taken us to some seriously deep places. So to our listener out there, we'll leave you with this. If, as Keller suggests, this very idea of a solely loving God has its roots in Christianity, what does that mean for how we understand love itself? Is it possible that a love that never opposes or allows for consequences is ultimately an incomplete, even harmful kind of love? Something to ponder as you continue your own exploration of this timeless and deeply personal question.